Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, and welcome to this webinar on driving diversity, unlocking the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Kaila Colbin. I am the co-founder of Boma Global and the founder and chief executive of Boma New Zealand. It is my absolute pleasure to be your host for today's session. We have a super packed 60 minutes ahead of us. It's going to go really fast, I know. So I just want to start with a few things. The first is I want to acknowledge Nai Tuahuriri. I am broadcasting to you from Otautahi Christchurch here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Nai Tuahuriri hold mana whenua status, the tribal sovereignty over this land that I am broadcasting to you from. So I want to give my acknowledgement to them. With thanks to Nai Tuahuriri, I will also acknowledge we have a global audience today. We have people from, I think it's close to 10 different countries. We have people tuning in from New Zealand, from the US, from Europe, from Russia. So a huge welcome, hi to by New Zealand, welcome to all of you around the world. This is a global event. On that note, our topic today, driving diversity, because this is a global event, this is not a topic that we're going to take through the lens of a specific culture. This is not a session about driving diversity in the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's not an event about driving diversity in the context of the United States. It's a conversation about things we should all generally be understanding about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how we can all improve our skill, our sophistication, our attention to these concepts. We do have closed captions enabled for this session. If you want to see the live transcript as it is unfolding, you can just click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and choose show subtitle. These are the automatically generated captions from Zoom. So we're grateful for your feedback as to how good they are. We will certainly do our best to speak clearly so that the AI can understand what we're talking about. We're also live streaming this event. So I know we have attendees tuning in onto the Zoom webinar from all around the world. This event is being broadcast onto our social platforms as well. So hello to you if you are tuning in from Facebook, from Twitter, from anywhere else on the planet. And finally, we are recording this call to be shared later. So I know Donald has so many wonderful insights to share, and we want to make sure that those insights are available far and wide to as many people as possible. Before I introduce Donald, before we kick things off, I want to start with a little poll, and the poll is pretty straightforward. The question is, how would you categorize yourself on your DEI journey, on your journey towards diversity, equity, and inclusion? We'll go ahead and launch that poll. Give you 10 seconds. And we'll close that poll and post the results. All right, so we've got, oh my gosh, it's like a perfect bell curve. So we've got people ranging right from novice to pro with what's the word for it? The plurality, the mode, the one with the highest number of responses is intermediate. Absolutely fantastic. You know, this is a great way to segue into the introduction of our guest, because from where I sit, no matter where we sit on that continuum, there is always further to go on this journey. So with that, it is my incredible pleasure to welcome our esteemed guest to today, Donald Thompson. Donald is a co-founder and CEO of the Diversity Movement. He was recently named to the Forbes Next 1000. He's been named to the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies. He is a certified diversity executive, speaker, investor, and advisor for organizations of all sizes. He's a mentor for Google for Startups, Black Founders Exchange, and he wrote a wonderful book called Underestimated, A Black CEO's Journey to Success, which is due out at the end of August this year. Donald, I will invite you to make yourself seen to our audience. It's so wonderful to be here with you today.
I am very, very glad to be here, Kaila. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. And so I'm raring and ready to go. And one of the things that, just through your example, I wanted to take a moment and begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today. And I myself am calling from Raleigh, North Carolina. We're on this digital platform, but I want to give honor and respect to the traditional land of the Kahara people of where I sit. And that was an interesting dialogue. And I'm learning and growing as we go together.
Can I just touch on that for a second? Because, I'm going to go off script immediately, right?
Okay.
But like you and I, in the run up to this, we had an exchange where we both went, man, we're about to host this webinar on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we both had this huge learning exchange. And so first of all, right off the bat, I noticed for myself that my display name has changed itself again and has removed my pronouns. So I'm going to go ahead and add those pronouns back. Zoom has a feature now where you can add the pronouns at the admin end, but it doesn't seem to be working properly. And we had this exchange where I had introduced to you this concept that we do here in Aotearoa, New Zealand about land acknowledgement. And I had not, up until yesterday, included my pronouns on my display name. And so I think just coming back to this point of, there is always farther for us to go on this journey, hey?
That's exactly right. And one of the things we talked about, and it's a great way to segue into our conversation, the word you used is really powerful. It's that learning exchange, right? One of the things that is really, really simple about diversity, equity, and inclusion that everyone can learn and do tomorrow is, number one, let's keep the curiosity that we all had as children, that openness to learn and experience new things. And then let's just keep that open mind to be thoughtful listeners of people that have a different point of view, right? So that we don't lose sight of that learning moment because we're just waiting to respond to try to convince. And those are two elements of that learning journey that all of us can continue to improve and do better. And just that humility that you show another person is going to create a better bond, even if you're far apart on so many other things, even if it's a tough business discussion, even if you're launching something in a new country that's not as known to you. There's that universal language of appreciation that we can all show one another.
I love that. One of my favorite quotes is from Joseph Joubert, who said, "The aim of any argument or discussion should be not victory, but progress." Donald, I'm going to start. Let's bring it right back to the basics here. I'm going to start with the most foundational question. I think everyone on this call will be familiar with the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. But can you just break those down for us? Explain the difference between the three at the most basic level.
I would love to do it. And whether I'm speaking with executives or mid-level managers or frontline workers, we all need to have some level of fundamental alignment on what words mean. And that allows us to have much more powerful conversations. So when we think about diversity, right, we can think about it from a racial perspective, a sexual orientation perspective, generational, but really it's not having everything be the same, like a vanilla ice cream cone, for example. Vanilla is a flavor of ice cream, right? If we're going to have a diverse environment, we need to have a variety of people that are represented. And that variety can be thought through from all of the different constructs of DEI. We like to call it the kaleidoscope. So that can be generational, that can be socioeconomic, that can be from a global perspective when you're thinking about representation from different countries. And sure, it can be race, gender, sexual orientation, kind of the big three. So diversity is that variety, that kaleidoscope of differences that we need to bring to the table to have a real powerful thought exchange. When we think about equity, a lot of times people get that mixed up between equity and equality. And so the very simple thing that I do is I use a personal example around equity. So as a young child growing up, I had these big, thick glasses, and I would always get made fun of, right? And 4 eyes and different things. And that's a story for another day. But I would ask my teachers if I could sit closer to the front of the classroom where I didn't need my glasses, but I could still feel very involved in the conversation. I could see the chalkboard very clearly. I didn't have to squint. I could be more immersed with the subject matter. And by default, I did better in classes that I got to sit in the front. Overwhelmingly, my teachers were like, well, sure. And there was always another child in the class that would be willing to sit back a row or two. And so that's an example of equity. It was a small but impactful accommodation that allowed me to get more from that classroom setting. Equity is as simple as having a ramp so that those that are in a wheelchair or those that going up the stairs, it's not even anything other than as we age, stairs and steps for our knees, right? Versus being able to walk up a gradual incline of ramp. Those are examples of equity. Another example of equity in a business context, we all learn differently. So if you send out an agenda 15 minutes before the meeting, then those of us that are quick learners and we can do things on the fly, no problem. But what about the people in the room that need to process information differently, that need to prepare their thoughts before they go into a meeting? So equity in a business context is sending the agenda a day before or 2 days before, so that all types of learners can be engaged in the conversation. So when I talk about equity, when I talk about diversity, I like to use real life examples. And then inclusion is that activation. Do we give the appropriate assignments and opportunities for advancement in a business context in that broad construct? Inclusion in a business meeting session, if someone's an introvert and they're in the meeting and they're quiet most of the meeting, as the leader, do you say, John, Jeffrey, Susan, would you like to add a comment? That is inclusion, where we're pulling people into the mainstream of the dialogue, the work, and giving everybody an opportunity, everyone an opportunity to be a full member, full participant, even though they might have a different learning style, a different perspective, or a different personality. And those things in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion are very, very simple. And we can all impact them in a positive way in the work that we do inside and outside of our businesses.
Thank you so much for that. You know, there's something that in the way that you've described that, the title of this webinar is Moving Beyond the Checkbox to Unlock the Power of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And when I think about that, you know, we often have this idea of diversity about being, oh, we better make sure that we have a Black person on the team, or a woman, or an Indigenous person. And once we've done that, we are now diverse. And what I'm hearing you describe is that actually by having a team with people with all different backgrounds and life experiences, not just about gender or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, by creating space to have contributions from people with all different experiences, we will actually become richer as a result, richer in the fullest sense, richer our hearts, richer our lives, richer our organizations, richer. My question, and I'll also just flag, I should have said right at the beginning that this is prime time morning commute here in New Zealand. And my studio is like, I do my best to make it soundproof, but nothing is sufficiently soundproof to 3 determined little boys. So if you're hearing banging, that's what's going on there. But so bringing to the critical question here, the critical question is, you know, when we're talking about moving beyond the checkbox, right? We have all these organizations that are seeing, oh, well, organizations with more women on the board outperform, so we better get a woman on the board, but we're not going to actually listen to her, and we're not going to factor her opinions in, and we're going to talk over her. What is the business value in doing this in a way that is not about ticking the checkbox, that is about what you're describing, this humble, curious, open-minded, genuine appreciation that each one of us only has a view like this, and the more views we add, the bigger our perspective is and the more we can achieve?
Yeah, I love the question and appreciate it very much. I think When I'm thinking about the work with diversity, equity, inclusion, if we take it even a step higher in our business construct, it's building a winning culture. And that winning culture requires us to be an innovation-driven organization, because we're really trying to win the war of ideas. And that's whether you're a nonprofit, that's whether you're a business, you're trying to figure out what's next and get there first. You're trying to understand how to push your business forward and innovate. It's very hard to do that with a homogeneous team. It's very hard to really look at all the different variables that make a great product both marketable and brand building when you only have one lens that you're looking through. And we can think about this from a construct of a global footprint. We can think about this from a construct of how certain words land differently in the United States, but are very different in India, might not even translate word for word in Germany. And if you only have one lens that way you're looking at building your brand or goal, you're at a disadvantage in business. And most leaders don't want to be at a disadvantage. They're trying to chase strategic advantage. And so in order to do that, you've got to have not only many differences around the table, but you actually have to incorporate those into how you grow. Let me give a very specific example. I won't name drop on the company, but they're a product development organization, and they're leveraging their employee resource groups in product development to ensure that the marketing messages, to ensure that the product rollout and the packaging aligns with the emotive construct of the different types of folks in their organization. Because they have a broad construct in the market that they want to sell to, but inside their company, because they do have reasonable diversity, they just weren't using it to unlock innovation. And that's really the step that we want to help corporations make, and nonprofits and organizations, is how do you use that diversity to unlock innovation that can drive growth, that then can be measurable in your bottom line.
I love that. And not only drive innovation, but potentially save embarrassment in some cases. I wrote an article a long time. I used to write for, there's a show called Top Gear, which is all about cars. And I used to write for the magazine Top Gear, which is tied to the show. And I wrote an article about car naming conventions. And there's a really famous case here in New Zealand where Mitsubishi has a car that's called the Pajero. But of course, in Spanish, pajero means wanker. It means someone who masturbates. and this is the I'd love to, if I could, just share with you a little story. So one of the things that I'm aware of is that the more closely we align to the dominant paradigm, the more incumbent it is upon us to understand our own blind spots and limitations, because the more closely we align to the dominant paradigm, what we get taught from when we align to the dominant paradigm, what we get taught from birth is that our perspective is the perspective. And the example that I want to share about this, and why I think it's so important for us to be aware when we're in this work of where our blind spots are. So dominant paradigm in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I live, in the US where I'm from, is, white, straight, cisgender, heterosexual male. And I align to the dominant paradigm in every way except my gender. And so I love to read, and I love fantasy novels. And I discovered last year a new to me fantasy author. And I was reading this book, and I was a third of the way through the book when there was a line in the book that indicated that the protagonist was Black. And I did a double take, because up until that moment, like, unless I'm told otherwise, the default is that the protagonist looks like me. The default is that our rugby team or our soccer team is the boys, and we only need to specify when it's the women. So I guess my question to you is, can you speak a little bit to what we can do to help unlock our own blind spots? And before you answer that question, what I will also invite to our audience, I know we've got attendees tuning in from all over the world. The Q&A is open. We would love to hear your questions as well, so feel free to chuck those questions in there. But Donald, what can we do to help mitigate our blind spots so we don't make atrocious blunders like launching a car into the market called Wanker?
It's a beautiful question. And I think it's a couple of things. Number one, I'll use myself as an example. I'm surrounded by some really talented people in all the different businesses I work with and invest with. And a lot of people are, but you have to intentionally listen to them. You have to intentionally seek out advice before you make significant decisions, right? From the people that you have access to. And that's something as a leader that you have to humble yourself, that what am I missing? Number one, that's the negative construct. The second piece to why you want to do it is, what could I add that would make this idea better? Right? And that's the positive construct. And there's both, right? There's things that we don't want to do because we don't want to be loose with our language and use those kind of those hidden microaggressions or different things that we would say. For example, I've heard in meetings and many times, listen, we want to run this program straight down the line. Don't go off the reservation. Right? Now, you have to decide in those moments when you hear those things, is that an intentional racial slur, or is that somebody that grew up in an era where that was acceptable language? Right? And how do you gently work with things when you see them in real time? However, when you have a diverse group of leaders and a strong group of leaders, then somebody can say, John, can we get a quick moment after this meeting? I just want to ask you a quick question. And you can educate that individual, because most people don't know what they're doing and how it impacts other people. So we have to take those opportunity moments to create that learning exchange. But the second thing that I do, and this is again personal in terms of how do I keep from missteps and mistakes, is number one, I realize that I'm going to make them, and I give myself some room to practice without penalty. And now it allows me not to live on or walk on eggshells all the time. But when I do need to be gently reminded or course correct, or sometimes I will fall into saying you guys instead of everyone, right? So the way that I do it is I'm surrounded by people that we kind of check ourselves, right? And we think about it. And in the workplace, right? In the diversity movement, for example, we have to realize that even though we're working in this DEI space and we've been trained and we have certifications and we have all this stuff, we still have 20, 30, 40 years respectively of thinking that's not completely correct or accurate. And so we've got to keep that humble mindset and ask others, but mostly give yourself the freedom that this is a learning journey, right? And I think that's so important, because that keeps you open, right, to feedback from others. And then it also gives you a little bit of grace, because we all misstep a little bit and there's all room to learn.
Okay. Can you, can I just say, this was like you ticked every word that speaks to my heart in what you said. So here are the words that jumped out to me that are words that I think we should all be living by kind of all the time. Humility, curiosity, compassion, empathy, and then most of all, the last word you used, grace, giving ourselves grace and giving others grace. So, so, so important. And that awareness that we are all going to mess this up repeatedly. And that approach, when we're talking about educating others, that we're not coming at this from a punitive or a corrective, yes, but not a punitive or a judgment lens. We're coming at this from the lens of an invitation. And I want to share with you a little example of this. So we've got a non-gender binary person on our team here in New Zealand, and I am super mindful. Like, I'm constantly inviting others to say they, it's not her, it's they. And last night I was home and I was chatting with my 13-year-old stepson, and I said we had a strategy day yesterday, and they had told us a story about their mom. And I said their mom, and I think because I was saying mom, I slipped and I said her mom. And my 13-year-old stepson said their mom, like caught me on it. And I was so stoked that he had pulled me up on this. And just this willingness to go, you know what, we are all going to stumble all the time. And that stumbling doesn't make us a bad person, an uncaring person. It makes us a human person. I'd love to pull a question from, we've got a bunch of questions coming in now from the audience. I'm going to pull a question from the audience from Scott Mallory here. Great points on making innovation itself a main driver or motivation, that optimizing for innovation will naturally bring about diversity, equity, inclusion. What ethics principles can be drivers here, and what data-driven approaches can be leveraged overall? How can we use data to understand, and especially I'm gonna expand on Scott's question here, especially if we're looking at moving beyond the checkbox, how can we use data without sliding into the, oh, well, we have 23% female or 42% non-white?
So yeah, let me start with the data construct. 67%, and this is more of a US metric, but I'll use this for the answering the question, of folks that were surveyed, right, look at DEI behaviors, DEI content, related content around brands before they decide to go to work somewhere. And so when you think about that as an overarching theme, right, for your organization, your nonprofit, that means that if you're trying to win the talent war, close to 70% of the people that are evaluating you are evaluating your behaviors of how you treat others, not just what your product delivers as a function, but what we like to term the triple bottom line, right? People, planet, and profit. And so that 67% is a very significant number, right? When you look at the hiring trends and that talent pipeline that we're all very, very much fighting for. The other thing that you can look at when you think about data construct, and I'll start with the employee piece, but I'm going to tell a quick story. There's a tech company that we were working with, and I talked to one of their very high performers that was looking at leaving the business, not because they didn't like the product, not because they weren't making a lot of money, but because they did not have a specific career pathing. And they saw that pretty consistently for people of color. So then I asked the chief people officer and the CEO, what is the impact of losing a $3 million sales producer because you don't have that sense of belonging? You don't have an ERG that aligns with this person's narrative. And the CEO was like, that would be very painful. A $3 million producer is in the top 3 to 5% of performers in our company. Typically, I don't know who you're talking about because it was a confidential conversation. It would take someone 3 to 5 years to develop a book of business to do that. So it's not a function of just losing $3 to $5 million in revenue. It is a function of the training, the recruiting, the time in the market. That's probably a $10 to $15 million revenue hit if they lose this multi-year sales producer because the environment in the company doesn't lead to belonging, inclusion, and promotability for people of color. That is a very significant financial impact. And so when you think about the cost of turnover, that's one easy thing, hire another person. That's not the whole answer. It is the cost of somebody that is now not only proficient in their role, but highly productive. I'll give another example on the metrics and the impact on employees. So I was talking with a company, and they're German-based company, and I did a presentation to the leadership team, and the CEO just wasn't into it at all, right? Like it just like they brought me in, and they probably had to twist it, but he just wasn't into it, right? So long and the short, they didn't really go much further other than checking the checkbox. But their chief human resource officer left the company 4 months later and went to a competitor. The cost of attrition from top performers because DEI is not properly engaged in the organization is a measurable and a very expensive outcome. The other thing, when you think about how do you drive real innovation and growth, think about one of the beautiful things about marketers and big brands is they pay attention to data, even if it's not permeated throughout the organization. So for example, all of us can notice in commercials and print ads, there's much more diversity. There's no longer just the skinny woman in jeans. There are all different body types. They're all different shades. We're now, as a global society, starting to change the construct of what beauty is. Now, do we think that all these companies are doing that because they had a heart change? Some of them are, but some of them are doing it because they know that people are now making financial buying decisions to spend their money, time, and energy with brands who get them, where they feel a personal attachment to the brand promise. And so those are some areas where the diversity, equity, inclusion mindset, the mental model of the company, affects the business and the bottom line.
Awesome. I love that. There's something I would add here. I love the specifics that you spoke to there about attraction, recruitment, retention, mitigating the cost of attrition, which is massive. For me, with data, one thing that we noticed in our organization, I've got a small company in New Zealand. There are 10 of us, and as we first started to grow, we had no men on the team for the first kind of 7-8 people, and I would say repeatedly that we had a gender balance problem in the organization. And I was talking to a guy who founded he's from YPO in Sydney, founded quite a large company. And I was telling him that, we had this challenge. And the frustrating thing for me was that when I looked at the challenge, every reason I could come up with for why this was a challenge was every sorry excuse that every white male board chair has ever given for why there aren't more women on the board, or it was like it was every pathetic excuse. And I was like, this is not acceptable. I was like, oh well, we try and we advertise, but we choose the best one for all the things you're never supposed to say. And I'm talking to this guy, and I said, I'm struggling with this, and he said, you need to do what I needed to do, but in reverse. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we had a gender balance problem where we had more men than women. And what we had to do was we started inviting women to review our job ads. We started looking at where we advertised. We started looking at the groups we reached out to in order to connect. And so we had a question here from someone about, how do we identify a blind spot? And I'm going to tie that question back to Scott's question about data, which is that what the data did, it didn't give us the answer, but it showed us where the problem was, right? If the data is saying that repeatedly we're only getting women or non-gender binary folk applying for our roles, then that tells us we have a problem. Then we have to dig in to understand why that problem is coming through in the data, right? That data showed us that we had a blind spot. Then we had to go like this to work out where the blind spot was so that we could uncover it and address it.
No, I think that's beautiful. I mean, the data can speak the truth to you if you're willing to look at it. Then you can discuss it, and then you can figure out what to do about it. And I think the other thing with data is that data is not necessarily bad or good. It's data. If what people try to do is this is an example, it's not an amazing one, but it makes the point. So I was talking with a client, and I was reviewing their strategic DEI plan. And it highlighted a specific growth in DEI around gender. But it didn't really talk about the kaleidoscope of DEI. Now, the reason a lot of companies will focus on gender is it's actually easier to find, promote, and recruit white women. And then if you have the gender balance, then you can scream diversity. and you move on to the next thing. It limits your responsibility to look broadly at what DEI means and impacts, right? And so a lot of times we have to leverage third parties to help us review the data so that we can minimize our own biases of how we interpret the data. Right?
And that's exactly what happened to me, right? I had to have someone else point out to me that, this question about how we identify we have a blind spot. One of the ways I think we identify we have a blind spot is by continually seeking feedback and external perspectives, right? Which is, it helps us move further on our diversity journey. But actually, once we've moved further on our diversity journey, the whole premise is we're getting heaps of additional perspectives, right? So
Absolutely.
that we can see the things that we don't see.
I love that. And the other additional benefit, one of the reasons that companies and organizations do not meet the diversity goals intent that they want is most of our hiring is our top people are referrals, not through posted ads and different things. And so we have to think about our networks, and we have to think about how do we build our networks for the team we will need in a year or 2 years. Because if it's reactionary in our hiring and growth, we're going to default to our comfort level. But if we think a little bit further ahead, then we can say, wait a minute, if we need a strategic consultant for our board, that might not be a diverse board member, but let's make sure we do a broad search and bring someone that has a multicultural mindset and the skills to do this work for our board. It gives our board exposure. It creates a different network partnership for referrals. So I encourage people that say, question I get a lot with corporations is, well, I can't change my diversity demographics overnight. And I say, absolutely, that's correct. That's very true. This is a journey process, but you can make moves that give you an opportunity to create more network effect in a sense, so that you can broadly be building those relationships. So we're not in the same place a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And I think that's very, very important.
Awesome. Okay, we have another question here from Rachel, who's asking, when we're looking at events and programs, speakers, there's a new Twitter account that just got started in New Zealand called Manel Watch, to looking at conferences where they've got panels that are all men, known as Manels. The question from Rachel is, how can we manage authentic DEI versus tokenism? How can we build in DEI to the planning rather than ending up with 3, wonderful white men that at the end we're going, oh gosh, what do we need a woman, or we need a Black person, or both, or a Maori person, right? How can we make sure that that's part of the planning process?
So when you're thinking about, and these are all amazing questions, when you're thinking about building an event and panels and different things, it really does come back to that network effect. Most of the business people that if you ask the right questions, can either put you in touch with someone that has a network of diverse candidates that they work with, that they have vetted, right? One of the challenges people have is, I don't want to lower standards. I want an amazing this, or I want an amazing this, right? And these are just things that I hear that I chuckle a little bit. But you don't really know if you have the best event panel if you've not looked at a diverse group to be on that panel. You don't really know if you've made the right strategic hire if you've not really had a broadened search. And so it takes a little bit more effort, but I would say be very intentional to reach out to me. For example, not me as the speaker, but if you have a speaker and you need somebody that's expert in finance, that's been a CFO, that works in mergers and acquisitions and has a global footprint, and you don't have that in your network. Well, now that you're on this webinar, we should connect on LinkedIn after this meeting. And my network, because I've sold and worked with companies in India, in Germany, in France, because I have a good US footprint, I probably could be helpful in connecting you with some people for you to consider. It doesn't mean they're going to be the right folks for your event or your company, but to consider. And then when you start to do that, the folks that I recommend become a part of your network as well. And then over time, all of a sudden your network is stronger and more robust. And then you have better and better choices. But there is a responsibility on each of us to be active contributors to our respective networks so that we can start to do those things better, faster, quicker.
Awesome. I love that. I've got a question. So there's a comment here from Lior Christine Locker. Forgive me if I've gotten your name wrong in terms of pronunciation there, but the comment is about kind of moving beyond data here, that it's often about little things that don't show up in data. So Lior's employer doesn't have an LGBT plus group and doesn't track this, but when Lior changed their name, the employer was super lovely, and Lior cares more about that than whether they change their logo on Pride Month. That loveliness, that conversation being a straightforward and easy conversation, that welcoming, that sense of belonging, doesn't really show up in data tracking, but Lior says does mean the world to them. So do you have the question I'm going to put over top of Lior's comment is, do you have any thoughts or comments about how we can be mindful of not only the data that we're tracking, but how we're showing up for our teams across all of their colorful glory?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So a couple of things, and really it's how can you do authentic marketing and storytelling about the company's strengths that don't show up in the data? And one of the things with the example that we just described, and I'll use one from a small company I was working with, we did not have a birthing room for new mothers that needed to pump during the day, right? And so, and at the time with this company, there were 3 ladies that had gone on maternity leave at the same time. So it was a thing for them to be productive and be welcomed back. We had to create that space because we're a small company, hadn't experienced that before, but we put a lock on a room. We made sure that room had a couch in it. It was very comfortable. The temperature was good. There was a refrigerator in the room. It was a large enough refrigerator that 2 or 3 people could put different things in different spaces. And so we made that accommodation. And here's what occurred. That spread throughout the company that we had been thoughtful. And so it is when companies do it right, share those positive stories. It's so easy and prevalent when companies get it wrong. But the example I used, the example our guest used, are those powerful stories of when we get it right. The other thing that I think is really, really important when we're doing that is what are the learnings from that experience that can show up in how we're telling the story in recruiting new team members. And it does not have to have specific names attached to it, but that story can still be told that yes, we're learning as an organization. We don't want to be inauthentic and just change, right, our logo at Pride Month. But here's our LGBTQ affinity group, and here's how it's doing. If an employee has a accommodation that is required, here's the process to work with our HR team to discuss that. We may have it accounted for, we may not, but we want to hear about it in our company. And so using those kind of action-oriented processes to put it into the hiring process, to teach talent managers the right way to have those discussions is going to be very, very important to getting the right voice, the right language, the right message that we're a welcoming organization and we want to help people win at work.
I love that. Can I just say for a second, when you said we didn't have a birthing room in our company, I thought you meant a room for people to give birth in. And I was like, how many people are like giving birth at work? And maybe we should look at your, the home life balance here.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I might have misspoke on that.
Some really important things though that I heard you saying here. One of the most important things I think is this normalizing of us being on a learning journey. And I think this is a theme that has come through right from, the beginning of today's session when we were talking about our own experience in the run up here in terms of the pronouns and the land acknowledgement. We've got a question here, which is about whether it helps to address blind spots if we articulate instances of shame. And I want to elaborate on this a little bit because, as you know, I am a certified Dare to Lead facilitator. I had the privilege of training with Brene Brown, and shame is deep, deep, deep embedded in all of the Dare to Lead work that I do. And so, like you, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's useful, I think, here to come back to definitions. And the definition of shame that we rely on is the deeply painful feeling that we are somehow flawed. There's something wrong with us and we're not worthy of love, belonging, or connection. Shame is distinct to guilt. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. And what I would say here is that one of the reasons that I think we avoid difficult conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion is because we feel a sense of shame. I am a bad person because I did not pay sufficient attention to someone's gender or someone's ethnicity or someone's sexuality or even someone's diversity of thought. And I, earlier on, I said, we don't want to do this in a punitive way. And I was struggling for a second word. The second word here is we don't want to do this in a way that is shaming of others. Do you have any thoughts as to how we can work with people so that we can acknowledge that risk of shame response, that protection? I think a lot of people, when they go, oh, I don't need to have this conversation, I'm not racist. And that to me is a shame protection response of,
Yes.
if I am racist, does that mean I'm a bad person, not worthy of love or belonging? How can we move past that so that we can actually get to real progress in our organizations?
So I'm going to answer the question and then also appreciate the correction, breastfeeding facility. And so those are all but I bring that back up only because we have to just help each other in our language, and getting it wrong can't be overly punitive, because if you listen to tone and intent of people, you can tell when someone's attacking you or someone is uninformed, right? And we have to help people that are uninformed be more informed, or we can miss those moments, right? And so to answer this question very specifically, one of the things in our work, we don't use the term often, right? White privilege. We talk about privilege. We all have different forms of privilege. I grew up in a 2-parent home. I have privilege. I had the opportunity and was afforded a very powerful education coming up through elementary and middle school and different things, that my parents from the very deep South in the United States moved to the North, to Connecticut. And that move changed the trajectory of my family because the educational opportunities were different. That's privilege. And so if we talk about privilege as a broad construct, we can bring more people into the conversation versus leading a conversation talking about white privilege. That has a certain, if the goal is to create guilt, if the goal is to create shame, then say white privilege, right? If we're trying to educate so we all have better understanding, we talk about privilege, and then we can move to the responsibility we all have with our privilege. So one of the things that we try to do, and we don't always get it right, I'm not coming from that place, but we try to make sure our language is bringing people to us, not creating more division. And that's what we try to do, right? And that is our opportunity. So that's number one. The second thing that's really, really important is to not be overly offended or emotive with people that don't get it, right? Like that people that aren't on the journey at the same level that we are. Any organization, when you start to have a little bit of education, you've been in the space, we all can get this intellectual arrogance, right? And so if someone uses a phrase that's wrong, or just, I don't get this diversity stuff, right? Now all of a sudden it's us versus them versus a simple question of, well, why? Tell me about your experience. What do you think is a falsehood in it? Help me understand. Obviously, I'm a big fan, right, of diversity, equity, inclusion, but what are some of the things that you're struggling with? And when I've come across it more inquisitive and curious, I'm typically able to tease out the roadblock to further dialogue. And a lot of times people want to be understood. Well, I grew up in a trailer. I grew up poor. So I don't understand all of this about just it's because of race or just because of this. I was like, oh, well, us talking about more people of color in leadership is not a dig on the hard work that you put in to grow your career in your life. It's just acknowledging that some of our structures are not helpful to women, to people of color, to people with a sexual orientation that's not considered in the majority group, right? And so all of these things play into the way we see each other. And so you took it in a way of attack, but really it's about a way of advancement for all of us. Now, whether that works or not, what I know works is me having more of an open dialogue with someone longer allows me to move them than me having a short dialogue that's high octane negative. That never works because now we're just debating to win the argument. We're not really trying to understand one another. And so those are a couple things that I think through and try to make sure my behaviors represent when I'm talking with folks.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is that it's really about consistently coming at these conversations with a spirit of invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think about, we talked right at the beginning, we did that poll. We saw that there was people were right along the spectrum in terms of how they rated themselves on understanding diversity, equity, inclusion issues. And I think about this as if we're on a path, and it could be like a pathway trail going up a mountain or something. And maybe the mountain is infinitely high. There is no summit to this mountain. And maybe I'm 2 steps further ahead on the path and, you're 5 steps further ahead than me. And there are people who are further back. And I kind of have this mental picture of constantly kind of reaching back and going, hey, you can do it. Come on with me. Right. And I imagine if I were to turn back and go, what's the matter with you? How come you're not further up the mountain? That would not be particularly useful in encouraging more people to come further up the mountain.
Yeah, that's right. I saw something in the chat from Sally that I want to address. And
yeah, great.
It's really powerful in that Sally was like, we understand that everyone's not on the same journey level, but then there are situations and times where people are stepping into an arena that's not professional, that's not polite, that is not representing belonging, right? And so let me give a couple of examples, and I'm going to start simple and then move upwards. Historically, right? And I've been guilty of this. I'm improved. Men historically have talked over women in meetings and social sessions and different things. That it has been more prevalent that way than the other. Right? As I've grown and matured, and I'm in larger meetings, in boardroom settings and different things, and I see that, I don't let it go. I'll say, Carl, let's let Susan ensure that she finished her thought. And usually just that gentle statement, firm but gracious. Carl like, oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. And then Susan has the opportunity to finish her statement or not. But I created leadership in a moment versus waiting till after the fact when there was no learning opportunity and we didn't get the opportunity to course correct real time, right? That's a simple example. Here's another example that I've been in. I was in a meeting, and this was earlier in my career, so it was more risk, right? I'm a more established business person now, and so it's not as big a risk for me to do things like that. But I was in a meeting, and someone in the meeting said, well, the other side's being an Indian giver. And this was in a board meeting, the boardroom, big company conference room, and I had to make a decision. Do I let this go? Do I say something in the moment? Do I, what do I do? And I processed that for about 30 seconds. And then I said, hey, can I make a quick comment? I didn't do amazing in school. I just kind of got through, but that's not how I understand history. And the room got silent, right? And the gentleman said, I apologize. What I said was inappropriate. Can we talk about it offline? Can we finish the meeting? And can we chat about this offline? And I said, we absolutely can talk about it offline. And we finished the meeting after that awkward, it was awkward, like it was an awkward couple of minutes. But I decided that it was appropriate for me to engage because what I heard to me was out of bounds. And I needed to call that out. I think that there are times where you can see things that your personal involvement then is not appropriate. It may be an HR or leadership issue offline. You have to use good judgment there, but most of the time doing nothing is not the right answer, right? But you have to be thoughtful in when to engage in the moment, when to pull somebody aside, or when you're not the right person to address it. And it maybe needs to be someone from an HR standpoint, a more senior person, what have you. But it is a very good question that there are moments to where, yes, we want to give people space, but just like as we're learning and teaching anything else, when people are learning, there are points where correction is required, right? And we need to work on how to do that firmly, gracefully, but with power.
Yeah, 100%. And really, some of what you're talking about is coming back to, those definitions, that definition of privilege. I remember in Ijeoma Oluwa's wonderful book, So You Want to Talk About Race, she defines privilege as an advantage that we didn't do anything to earn. We happen to be born into a two-parent family. We happen to be born into a family with these financial resources. We happen to be born into a society that views us a certain way because of just who we are, that we didn't do anything to be who we are. And when we have those privileges, and then when we add on to them the power that comes from you becoming a more established businessman or someone being further in their career, then, with that great power, of course, comes great responsibility, and that need to be courageous to say the awkward thing, to call out the awkward thing, and recognizing it will be awkward. It will be uncomfortable. And in my experience, sometimes naming that fact actually goes quite a long way towards diffusing some of the awkwardness. Hey, I need to say something. It's going to be a little awkward, but I have to say it. I can't just carry it out of the room with me. I don't feel comfortable with you using the term Indian giver, like that, just naming that it doesn't feel great to have those conversations, but we have to have them. The other point you made is, who is the best person to have a particular conversation? And I remember having this conversation with someone where they were, I was with a couple, quite an old school couple, not really versed in these kinds of conversations. And they were talking about how, why should I feel guilty? I never owned slaves, that kind of conversation. And I said, well, I've never owned slaves. To the best of my knowledge, no one in my family has owned slaves, but that doesn't mean that I don't materially benefit from being born white into a society that was built off of the labor of slavery, right? And so this kind of this invitation to appreciate, and this couple turn around, and I forget how this happened, but the conversation, they ended up talking about how they knew this Israeli guy and Jews, and then the man in the couple says, and what it's like to be Jewish in Israel, be surrounded by people who hate you, and the man says, and at some point you have to wonder why they hate you. Now, my family is Jewish, and my mother and my mother's family, my mother was born in Holland during World War II. My direct family had experience in the Holocaust. And I found it so fascinating because when we're talking about the privilege that comes from being born white into a society with built on the legacy of slavery, I was very comfortable engaging in that conversation. As soon as it came to the kind of the undermining of my identity, I became like a goldfish. I was just like, I had nothing to say. And so sometimes this moment of going, I need to use my privilege to speak up, to say Indian giver is not the right term. And maybe there's a Native American in the room who is just gobsmacked that someone would choose to use this, and using our privilege as allies
That's
to
right.
be able to improve that conversation is, I think, so essential.
No, I think it's important. And the other thing I would just extend that is, what are we doing this for? Right. And we all want to be in a situation in our lives and our work that we can chase our goals and dreams without unnecessary barriers. Right. And so one of the comments in the chat was, the gentleman was talking about, he's in a group on an anti-racism committee, but a lot of the members are older and really set in their ways and don't think they have anything to learn and different things of that nature. And how do we handle that? And I just try to use examples with people and see if some of them stick. Right. And usually I'll use older white men in particular. Well, they have wives and they have daughters. Do you want your daughter to make the same compensation for the same job as a man? Well, of course. Right. If they're doing the same, if you personalize it, that person can relate to it and say, well, then that's what diversity, equity, inclusion is. That's just a small micro example that you understand because of your experience, because you want the best for your spouse, your partner, right? If you're in the traditional construct, your wife or your daughter, your child. You want all of your children to be treated in an equitable and fair manner at work. And usually that type of example aligns with it because it's a personal tug. And then I can expand it out to people that they don't know. It's very difficult to get people that are set in their ways to understand examples that they have no experiential connection to. It's very, very different. And that's how we've been able to, in our society, create an environment where, think about this, I'll use the United States as an example in this one. In the United States, in history books, when you're in elementary school, you are taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America, right? This is basic history 101, right? Nina the Pinta de Santa Maria, 1492, Christopher Columbus. How do you discover something when someone already lives there?
Yeah.
It's their home. But our society has created a narrative, even if it's on a foundation of falsehood, it's been repeated so many times, it is become truth. Yeah. And so you have to create those connections between an experience someone has, because you can't fight 150 years, 200 years, 500 years of bad data. So you have to create some relevance with what people can experience more near term, and then we can widen the lens to the bigger discussion. But I wanted to answer that question in the chat. The questions are amazing. Like, they're really good.
They're so good. Donald, we are actually out of time. Like, we knew going into this, you and I, that we could easily go for hours and days, and it's absolutely true. I just want to close again, coming back to those key words that I think are so fundamental to this discourse, so important for all of us. Those words of humility, curiosity, compassion, and then most of all, grace. And that is grace, giving others grace for where they are on their journey, giving ourselves grace for fumbling, being awkward, getting it wrong, but also challenging ourselves to have that courage to step into this arena together and to tackle this together, because we know the outcomes are so much more powerful when we do. So, Donald, with that, thank you so much for joining me this morning. It's been such a privilege for me to have this conversation with you.